Hello everybody, and welcome back to Cam Critiques. When Skyward Sword HD was first announced, I was pretty disappointed. For months, it seemed like there were no quality of life additions and minimal graphical updates. The price was ridiculous too. While Twilight Princess HD was $60 with an amiibo, Skyward Sword HD was $85 with an amiibo, and that amiibo was hard to get, and that amiibo looked to be the only quality of life improvement behind it when it was first announced. Skyward Sword on the Wii was $70 with a Zelda-themed controller. Skyward Sword HD is $140 with a Zelda-themed controller. I like Skyward Sword, but this remaster looked disappointing and the price seemed truly outrageous. But I was able to get a pre-order for a reduced price, so I decided to give it a try. I wanted to replay Skyward Sword anyway, and thankfully, it's a lot better than Nintendo made me think. So today, I'll be reviewing The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. Let's get started by talking about the gameplay. Skyward Sword plays much like every Zelda game released after Zelda 2 and before Breath of the Wild. You adventure through a fantastical world, meeting quirky characters, fighting many monsters, upgrading your gear and stats, and collecting interesting new tools you use to solve puzzles. If you're watching this video, you probably know what a Zelda game is. The formula worked in 1991, and it still works 30 years later. Skyward Sword was released as a 25th anniversary title for Zelda, and also as a flagship Wii Motion Plus title. So it incorporates lots of elements from other Zelda games and focuses very heavily on motion controls. This is both a good thing and a bad thing. As far as incorporating other elements from the series, I feel like it's done pretty sloppily. I'll go more into detail with some of the issues I have with how they pitched it as a prequel in the story section, but here I'm going to talk about the gameplay elements. This game has a weird structure. You start on a floating island in the sky near the center of the map, but most of the journey takes place in 3 regions below the surface. This is a neat gimmick, and it works well for the first act of the game. But then, presumably because this is a celebration of Zelda, you have to revisit all the areas for more dungeons, just like you did in Ocarina of Time. Sometimes this works well. For the desert area, they unlock an expansive and unique section of the map for each of your revisits. But for the forest section, they flood it and you have to waste 20 minutes swimming around collecting tadpoles. And for the volcano section, you just go up the same area 3 times with a bad escort mission inserted for one, and a bad stealth mission inserted for another. I would have much preferred if you fully explored the 3 areas one at a time, constantly discovering new locations as you played. Instead, you're forced to spend a lot of time backtracking. It worked in Ocarina of Time because the world in Ocarina of Time changed substantially before you revisited each area. It doesn't feel justified here. Similarly, you fly around the sky on your bird, called a Loftwing, discovering new islands and minigames because that's what you did in Wind Waker with the ocean. Except in Wind Waker, progression involved you constantly exploring new areas of the ocean in search of new islands. You do that in Skyward Sword for the first act, but then you just fly around the same sky, seeing nothing new for the other 2/3 of the game. It quickly becomes something that just wastes your time. It's another old mechanic that's inclusion doesn't feel justified. However, looking back, I do like a lot of what they kept from older games. As much as I love Breath of the Wild, it was missing some Zelda staples that I really wish were present. Stuff like heavily themed dungeons, unique NPCs, and interesting races. Skyward Sword is a little too reverent to past Zelda titles, but those Zelda titles are great, and many of the elements it apes are much appreciated. I feel more positive overall about the controls. I know many people are put off by motion controls, but I think they can be used well, and I mostly enjoy their implementation here. Almost every action in this game aside from walking is done via motion controls. You swing your Joy-Con like a sword with mostly one-to-one movement. You steer your Loftwing by tilting your Joy-Con. You control your items with a wide variety of Joy-Con movements. It mostly works, but in the Wii version there were 2 major issues. Firstly, if you had to recalibrate your controller, you had to put it flat on a table for a decent chunk of time. Now you just press the Y button and you can do it in an instant. Secondly, the camera was always finicky. There weren't enough buttons or sticks to allow for free camera control, so you had to stick with a weird auto camera or excessive Z targeting, constantly sending the camera directly behind you. Thankfully, the Joy-Cons do have an extra stick. So in Skyward Sword HD, you have free camera control. And now that I've played with it, I can't imagine playing without it. And even if you personally dislike the motion controls, Skyward Sword HD has new button controls. You use the right stick to control the sword, and everything else controls pretty much exactly how you'd expect. You do have to hold down a button to freely move the camera, which I found really hard to adjust to after having used the motion controls before, and I would still recommend that you play with motion controls. However, the button controls are perfectly functional. The main issue I have with Skyward Sword's gameplay is just how much it seems to want to waste your time. You backtrack through so many areas, slowly fly through the same grey blurry sky for hours on end. Listen to your companion Fee's ramblings every few minutes, it just gets tiring. And that issue is sadly still present to an extent. They didn't change the game's core structure, so there's still lots of backtracking. However, they did make Fi a lot better in this game. She bothers you way less in Skyward Sword HD than she did in the original. Her input was mostly changed to being activated by a button press rather than automatically, so it's now optional. This change is much appreciated. They also cut down some of the needless text in the tutorials, making them fly by much quicker. There are faster loading times as well, which makes the backtracking more manageable. Multiple hours of wasted time from the original are gone here. You'll spend most of your time playing this game solving puzzles. Even outside of dungeons, the overworld is very linear and you usually have to solve puzzles to progress. Even in combat, you're constantly solving a puzzle in a sense, having to find out the right way to do damage to each enemy. This doesn't sound too great on paper in my opinion. Most of the best Zelda games like Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild are so good because of how they utilize downtime. But, the puzzles in Skyward Sword are truly exceptional, and the constant revisits to Skyloft, which always provide you with new items to purchase and new side quests to complete, still do a good job of keeping the game well paced. The puzzles are the best part of this game for sure, but I can't really talk about them too much. I don't want to spoil any of their solutions. Just know they're varied, occasionally deep, and always well conveyed. When you're not solving puzzles, you're usually completing side quests or minigames. That's right, not exploring. Unlike most Zelda games, that's not a real focus here. There isn't lots of extra stuff to discover. The main story pretty much guides you in a straight line through every location. But I can't complain too much when the puzzles are as good as they are. The side quests are mostly great too, largely because of the great characters, which I'll get back to in a minute. The actual activities are usually interesting, and the rewards are almost always exciting to get. The minigames are a little more hit or miss. None of them are bad, but some of them, like carrying pumpkins, or shooting pumpkins, or playing music at the Lumpy Pumpkin, pretty much anything with pumpkins, are kind of frustrating. It's not always explained what you need to do to succeed very well, and lots of them go on for a little too long. They lack important items like heart containers behind luck-based minigames too. I like that they're here. They do a good job of adding just that much more variety to the gameplay, but they could be better. So, in conclusion, Skyward Sword HD isn't perfect gameplay-wise. The controls can be awkward, the minigames can be frustrating, and the backtracking can be excessive. But the core of the gameplay, the combat and the puzzles, is excellent. And a lot of the bad things are made more tolerable in the Switch re-release. I have some complaints obviously, but I was almost always having fun while I was playing this game. It was definitely worth putting up with the small things that hold it back. I give the gameplay of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD an 8.5 out of 10. Now, onto the story and characters of Skyward Sword HD. Skyward Sword acts as a prequel to the rest of the Zelda series. This is a neat concept, and learning about things like the origin of the Master Sword is really neat. But the vast majority of explanations offered feel very forced or poorly thought out. For example, they try to explain why Ganon exists and who he is, but it doesn't really make much sense. They try to go out of their way to explain why the Hylian shield has a red bird on it, but then they don't actually explain where the Hylian shield is from, and thus the bird explanation makes basically no sense. The whole prequel thing seems more like a forced gimmick than anything else. The Zelda series was clearly never intended to have a concrete timeline, and this game does a great job of demonstrating that. This game still has a pretty good story separated from the prequel stuff though, and this is largely due to the characters. Every single NPC has a unique design and personality. Zelda and Link are both actual characters with real involvement in the story. Other characters like Groose and Impa keep things interesting and also have significant roles in the story and even character development. Zelda games usually have a great atmosphere but a pretty shallow narrative. Zelda's typically just a damsel in distress, Impa is hardly relevant, Link usually feels soulless, etc. But here, things are different. And now that Skyward Sword HD has cut back on the obnoxious dialogue in the tutorials and from Fi, I have very little to complain about here character-wise. I wish Zelda was a little more involved, and I don't really like the way they take her character arc near the end of the story, but at least she has a character arc. Overall, the story and characters of Skyward Sword HD aren't perfect. The whole prequel gimmick isn't executed very well. But the actual narrative is a lot more interesting than that of most Zelda games. There are more characters involved, and they have more detailed character development. There are tons and tons of unique designs for different fantasy races and for different members of each race. Literally every Hylian is distinct. This game does a good job of telling a mostly interesting story and creating many interesting characters. And those characters even help to give this game a great atmosphere. I give the story and characters of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD an 8 out of 10. Now, onto the visuals and sound. Skyward Sword always had a great art style and a great soundtrack. The soundtrack in this HD re-release is unchanged, but it didn't really need to be changed. You've heard it throughout this review, you know it's great. I've had Ballad of the Goddess stuck in my head for about a decade now. The music here is epic, it's varied, it's catchy, it's just great. The sound effects are as good as ever too, swinging your sword still gives a satisfying swoosh. The visuals did need some changes though. The low frame rate and resolution of the Wii original really held this game back from looking great. And thankfully, the visual upgrades here are more than I expected. Some shading effects are redone, some textures are redone, and the whole thing always runs at a smooth 60 FPS at 1080p as far as I could tell. While I wish they would have done a little more to justify the high price tag, or just lowered the price, they did do enough to make this game look good. Models look clean, environments look nice, and colors really pop. Overall, Skyward Sword HD looks and sounds great. I wish it got the upgrade that Xenoblade Chronicles Definitive Edition did to its visuals and sound, while the upgrades got to its visuals were at least more than I expected. If this was released as a Switch game in this state, without the Wii original existing, I'd probably still praise its visuals. And again, the soundtrack is truly excellent. So I give the visuals and sound of The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD a 9 out of 10. In conclusion, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD is a good remaster of a great game. They could have done more or charged less, but they changed more than I expected and it was all for the better. This game has excellent puzzles, an engaging story, and a really appealing aesthetic. I got this for $50, and I think it's still that price on many retailer sites. And especially if you haven't played Skyward Sword before, I think it's well worth that price. I give The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD an 8.5 out of 10. Well, that does it for my review. If you liked this video, I'd really appreciate it if you liked, comment, hit the notification bell, and or subscribed. I'd also recommend you check out some of my other content like my ranking of the 2D Metroid games. Thank you all for watching, have a great rest of your day.